Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook. This podcast was sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. On October 8, 1918, 17 American soldiers of Company G, 2nd Battalion, 328th Infantry, 82nd Division flanked a German machine gun nest, surprising and capturing dozens of German soldiers. Then acting Corporal Alvin York, a conscientious objector turned warrior, was credited with leading the squad and single-handedly killing 20 Germans, knocking out 35 machine guns, and capturing 132 prisoners. York later received the Medal of Honor for this action, and his exploits were forever immortalized in the 1941 movie Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper. The World War I podcast covered the story of York in an episode back in 2017, but since then there has been additional scholarship. What about the other 16 members of the patrol? What role did they play in the action? And why is so little known about them? Is there more to the story? So to answer these questions, we welcome PhD candidate James P. Gregory Jr. to the podcast. He is the author of Unraveling the Myth of Sergeant York, The Other 16. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Can you start us off with some background information on York and the other 16 members of the patrol?
Sure. I mean, you've got 17 men that, as part of the 82nd, have such a variety of backgrounds. The majority of these men are immigrants. You've got 2 Italian, 2 Irish, 3 Polish, 1 Native American, and the others, just being born in the United States. So you've got a motley crew together. York is the only person from, south, the southern side, something he brings up quite often. But these others are, they work in New York City. They work at bars in Connecticut. Percy Beardsley works on a farm in Connecticut and lives out in the country, similar to York. So you've got a variety of backgrounds that honestly kind of sums up the AEF in general within this one little patrol. And it's these other little things that have come up in the past. I don't really go into them, but the fact that they've got such a variety of backgrounds has led some people to argue why some of these men have been left out of the story, because they were immigrants, because they were illiterate, things like that. So I think it's always important to bring out the fact that most of these men had just moved to the United States within 5 years of the war breaking out. And yet here they are fighting in France for a country that they had just moved to. Most of them, especially the key ones I know we'll talk about in this podcast, Otis Merrithew and Bernard Early, both are, Otis Merrithew was born in Massachusetts, and he's something I think we should bring up just here at the beginning, just because it becomes quite confusing. His name is Otis Merrithew, but if you've read any of the books before mine, they refer to him as William Cutting, because he served under the name William Cutting. When he registered for the draft, he registered under a false name because his mom didn't want him to register. But to his credit, when he was called up, he served under that false name. So instead of saying, no, it's not me, he did serve as William Cutting and then changed his records with the War Department later. But he's Otis Merrithew. And then Bernard Early, who we'll talk about quite a bit, he is also, he is an Irish immigrant. So he was born in Ireland. He had moved to Connecticut, worked in a bar, worked odd jobs throughout the area, and then was drafted just like the rest of these men. And then the others, follow suit, pretty similar. Either immigrants that are all just working class, or they are just farmers, laborers, et cetera, that are all drafted into the war.
Based on your research, how did October 8th, 1918 play out for these men?
So on the morning of 8 October, the Company G is tasked with pushing out of Châtel-Chery towards the Ducaville Railroad, and they don't get very far. It's about 8 o'clock in the morning. There's a thick fog, and all of a sudden they are inundated by machine gun fire from all sides. Their commanding officer is killed, Kirby Stewart, and so command passes to Sergeant Harry Parsons, and he selects acting Sergeant Bernard Early to take a group of men and try to flank the machine guns. So Early is given control of 16 other men, including Alvin York, who's, as you said, an acting corporal at the moment. he is actually in charge of a Shosho automatic rifle squad. So he's got Percy Beardsley with the Shosho and some ammunition bearers. So these 17 men follow Bernard Early. He leads them through the valley. The fog helps cover their tracks. They go through the woods. And Bernard Early leads them successfully behind enemy lines. And as they come up into a ravine, they run into some Germans getting water. They chase after the Germans, and they come across a large group of Germans eating breakfast, resting. And so Bernard Early orders his men to break apart into little squads and basically surround the Germans. And upon Early's command, they open fire. They kill a few Germans. They've surprised them. The Germans all surrender. So Bernard Early and 16 men have just captured around 80 Germans, and they've killed several more. So they push forward. Early orders Alvin York and his Shosho automatic rifle to watch over the prisoners. So he moves to a more advantageous position closer to the slope. And Otis Merrithew and Bernard Early line up the prisoners, and they take all their weapons. They take all their equipment and line them up and are prepared to walk out of this ravine with 80 prisoners, when all of a sudden a group of Bavarian sappers who were on the slope and had heard the gunfire yelled, "Get down." The Germans dropped and they opened fire on the Americans. Now, part of this myth is that, there were 3, 5, 25 machine guns. But the reality is the archaeology shows and the record shows there was not a machine gun in that ravine. There was a machine gun, but it was not operable. It was being carried. They didn't have time to set it up. So when you think about it, I mean, if there's 25 to 30 Bavarians that open fire in a very small ravine, it might sound like a machine gun to the Americans. But either way, this catches the men off guard. Several of them are hit. The others scatter for cover. Several are killed right off the bat. Murray Savage and a few others are wounded and are trying to crawl to safety when they die. Early is in charge, but he is quickly hit. Early receives 3 to 5 wounds, and some of them very severe. They said you could see his kidney through a hole in his back. And he gives command to Otis Merrithew. And so Otis Merrithew is in charge. York and Percy Beardsley are closest to the slope. They have the best cover. So they've returned fire. And in the process, several of the men return fire. Otis Merrithew is hit in the left arm, but he pulls out his revolver and continues the fight. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ravine, Percy Beardsley's Shosho automatic rifle runs out of ammunition. His ammunition bearers have been killed. So he pulls out his pistol and continues the fight. And in front of him, behind a tree, is Alvin York with his rifle and his pistol fighting against these Bavarians on the slope. And after about 10 minutes of this, the officer, Paul Vollmer, that they captured initially, he blows the whistle and forces the Bavarians to surrender because they're killing their own men with these bullets coming in. They can't see through the trees. And so he blows the whistle. They all surrender. They come down. Now there's 100 or so prisoners. And so Otis Merrithew, Alvin York, they are the 2 non-coms still standing. They line up the men. If you listen to Otis Merrithew's story, he's the one that told York to lead at the head because Early gave him command. But either way, York leads the group back out of this ravine. And in the process, they get behind a couple more German machine gun nests and capture those Germans. So they add those prisoners to their list. And then by the time they get out of that ravine, they've run into Company G. They've pushed forward enough. And so now what was 17 men is now down to 11. And out of the 11, there are 4 wounded. So these 11 men are walking out of these woods with 132 prisoners. They take them back. Merrithew is still up. He's still in charge. He's still barking orders. They come to the first aid station, and Alvin York is put in control. Merrithew is bandaged up. Early is loaded up onto an ambulance. Patrick Donahue, who got shrapnel in his shoulders, loaded up, and Mario Musi, who got hit, is also loaded up. So these 4 are taken away, and that now leaves York as the last non-com standing. And he is ordered to take the prisoners back to the prisoner pen. And when he gets there, he gets the credit for the capture, even though, technically you've had Early and Merrithew still there. So the battle itself is just a wild moment, 15, 20 minutes total of pure chaos. No one knows what's really going on, but in the end, 11 men capture 132 Germans, and one man ends up with the most of the credit.
Did the first reports reflect the action that you just described?
depends on what we want to refer to as the first reports. If we look at the first real mention of this, I mean, the records at the moment are, hey, did you just hear someone captured 132 prisoners? There's a few messages like that the day of. But the only first, real mention of this is when York is awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, and his citation says on October 8, York and 7 other men attacked this position, et cetera, et cetera. So it reflected a little bit of the fact that there were other men there. But by the time it got to the Medal of Honor investigation, that part was moved away, and the reports don't reflect what happened to anyone. There are some interviews with the other men from January 1919 would talk about their perspective, but those were never used in any official investigation. So the early reports do not reflect that story. They just reflect the story that Alvin York told his commanding officers.
Obviously, Alvin York, as you said, is the last non-com kind of standing at the end of this. And so he does initially get all of this credit. But at what point do the military, and then I think obviously the press as well, when do they really begin to focus on him? Is it when the Medal of Honor stuff starts, or is it even before that?
Well, with the Distinguished Service Cross was awarded in, I want to say it was October, but it wasn't too long after. But that would have been the end of the story, move on. It wouldn't be until after the war ended, when the 82nd is now sitting around, the men are trying to find ways to boost morale, and officers are looking for new excuses to save themselves. And so York's story had gotten around within the 82nd, and the commanding officers, Duncan in particular, sent him on a speaking tour with the 82nd Division chaplain. And he went around France and told everyone about his story and being a conscientious objector. But it still wasn't until January of 1919 when Duncan reached out to the Saturday Evening Press that it really became a story that the press decided to get a hold of. There's one article that got published before by Joseph Cummings Chase, but it was a very short paragraph that he wrote about Alvin York, and then he moved on. So it's January and the Medal of Honor investigation that really takes off with the press.
So I definitely want to talk about that Medal of Honor process. But in the book, you point out that Major General Duncan and Brigadier General Julian Lindsay, they might have had a few personal reasons to promote the idea of York as a single hero of a Medal of Honor worthy action. Could you tell us a little bit about some of those reasons and then walk us through the Medal of Honor process for him?
Yes, absolutely. So most people don't really think about it, but the generals in the AEF are not secure in their positions. You don't need 100 generals in peacetime. So they know that once the war is over, their ranks will be dropped back down to pre-war status if they haven't done something to keep their status, their reputation. And I was really struggling with that until I found a book by Pierpont Stackpole, and he was the aide to General Hunter Liggett. And Liggett was the commanding officer of both Duncan and Lindsay. And in reading this, it became evident that in October, especially October 6th through 9th, which fits the October 8th is the day of the action, that they had lost favor with General Liggett. He was very blunt about his feelings for them. He called Duncan stupid, deceitful, thinks that he should be rewarded for bungling everything and losing Hill 223, which just so happens to be the hill that everyone claims York was on, Hill 223. So Hunter Liggett was absolutely fed up with Lindsay and Duncan. He thought both of them should be replaced. He thought that they were just poor generals. They thought they couldn't control their men. And this obviously hurt their reputation. I mean, for two men that are wanting to secure their positions after the war, it's not good to have your commanding officer have a vendetta against you and be so open and blunt about how much he thinks you're an idiot. Well, on October 12th, I believe, Liggett ends up taking over the First Army. So he does move, and that might have saved them, but their reputations were already damaged. So if you've got two men who, in the eyes of their commanding officers, are failures, and Hill 223 is their biggest failure, all of a sudden in January, you have this story of a conscientious objector who you've given credit for capturing 132 Germans, and they think, oh, well, maybe if we attach ourselves to this. And Duncan becomes York's first press agent. He's the one that contacts the media. He's the one that, after the war, he goes to every event with York. He's always there. So this comes together in the Medal of Honor investigation. So in January of 1919, Duncan writes a letter to George Petullo of the Saturday Evening Post. And he says, hey, we have this story. I think it would be good for you to write about it. We're giving him the Medal of Honor. Why don't you come out? So George Petullo comes out, and the investigation in itself is questionable at best. A lot of people will use that and have in the past in other books referred to the Medal of Honor investigation as the be-all, end-all of proof. You know, the Army did its investigation. This is all you need to know. But when we look at the documents, the dates don't make sense. So it's February 5th that Alvin York is recommended for the Medal of Honor, and it's approved after investigation. Then on February 6th, these affidavits, which are just York's statement, these are not personal affidavits, are signed, quote unquote, by the men, the other men of the patrol. And then on February 7th, Duncan, Lindsay, George Petullo, Buxton, and York all go out to the site for the investigation. And then on that day, the paperwork is submitted saying, we've done our investigation. Alvin York should get the Medal of Honor. It's 3 days. And it means that they had already written down York's story and pushed the other men to sign it before they even went out to the site to do their investigation. So they had already decided on the course that this was going to take. They've already decided they're giving him the medal, and they just have to go through these steps. And on top of that, several of the men claimed that their signatures were forged. And two of them in particular, Fyodor Sok and Joseph Kornacki, they are signed with an X on their affidavits, and it just says his mark. But the problem with that is Theodore Sok, he signed his draft registration card. And on top of that, the 82nd Division had an English school at Camp Gordon to teach everyone how to read and write their name. So these signatures don't make any sense, and the men swear they were forged. But with the Medal of Honor investigation, George Petullo is there. He listens to York. He listens to York's story, and he writes up this story called "The Second Elder Gives Battle," discussing York's, conscientious objector status, and then gives him basically single-handed credit for doing everything. So George Petullo is the one who writes down that York is by himself. He says the other men were just hiding or guarding prisoners, and York did it all. I've seen the censored draft of George Petullo's article, and he started changing numbers, numbers of dead Germans, or he changed little facts. And it turns out that General Duncan made an agreement with him that George Petullo would be the only journalist allowed to publish this story, but Duncan had the final say in what he could publish. So Duncan had control of the story as well. So when this article goes out, Saturday Evening Post has got 2 million subscribers. It's the most read magazine in the country. It's been scrubbed by Duncan. It follows York's story, and it shows that York is single-handed and all the men did nothing. And all of a sudden, York becomes that overnight celebrity. And when they come back, York is paraded around town, taken around, and the other men just go home. All right. But it's that Medal of Honor investigation that really creates York's fame in the country. And on top of that, George Duncan's, because they went with him every single place he went when they got back.
How do the other members of the patrol respond to York's elevation?
Initially, they were annoyed. And in fact, it's not just the patrol being annoyed. There are plenty of accounts that I found from other men of the 82nd, from other companies, that were annoyed by this status elevation of York. They thought that, they knew the other men were there. They knew it wasn't a single-handed story like the newspapers were saying, the Saturday Evening Post was saying. And so for the men of the patrol, I mean, they're annoyed, and rightfully so, I would think. If you were there and it's a shared experience, and all of a sudden you come home and you're being told you weren't a part of that, you're lying. York did it by himself. But they just went home. They wanted to go home. They were tired. They couldn't care less about York. They just wanted to see their families. And so once they get back in 1919, they just go back home, and it's relatively quiet. They tell their story to their family and friends, but they don't make a fuss about it in the media.
What impact does the 1941 film Sergeant York then have on this saga?
Before I answer that, let me jump backwards just real quick to mention the 29 event, because the men didn't do anything. They didn't say anything. And it wouldn't be until 1928 when Alvin York's diary and book by Thomas Scahill is published. That makes him even more famous And Scahill himself is a known liar. He's known for forging stuff, and he edits the story even further. But in 29, the War College, the U.S. Army War College, holds an event and invites York and the other men to this event. And that's when the story gets out to the news that the other men don't support this version of the story. They don't support anything. And it turns out that there were actually recommendations for the other men of the patrol that the War Department had buried. And then I looked and I said, why did the War Department bury it? Well, guess who got promoted to work into the War Department? It's Major General George Duncan. He's the one that received those recommendations and then buried them. So the Army had to recognize that Bernard Early had been recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross and that the other men deserved medals. That all leads up into that 41 event. So this big moment in 1929 makes York a national celebrity again. And people read the book and people read the newspapers. And by 1939, World War II is looking like it's going to break out. And Warner Brothers is looking for ways to promote their perspective. The Warner Brothers themselves are Jewish, and they made a lot of movies before the United States entered the war that really kind of poked at Germany. And Alvin York's story to them seemed like it would be a great way. Conscientious objector. You're slow to start, but you fight all the way through. And so they come to Alvin York and they promote this idea. Initially, to his credit, he just wanted the movie to be about his religious conversion, but the screenwriters added more and more of the battle. And when Otis Merrithew and the other men learned about this movie, Otis Merrithew being the leader, wrote in to Warner Brothers and said, hey, we want to make sure we're represented. We want to make sure you include us in this movie. They never ask for money. They're not asking for fame. They just want to make sure that they are not left out of this story because they were all participants. And this spawns a complicated back and forth. This is the first movie ever made, like a biography pick, while the person was still alive. So York had full veto power in the contract. They could have made this movie, and then if York didn't like it, he could have said no, and it would have died right there. So they had to make sure York was happy. So Warner Brothers, initially, some talks were there to bring Otis Merrithew in as a kind of an advisor for the movie, but they thought, no, that would just make Alvin York mad. And so we can't have that. And Harry Warner just wanted to pay him off and get rid of him. He didn't want them to have any say in this movie. So there's a lot of back and forth. And eventually, Bill Guthrie, who used to work for the FBI and now worked for Warner Brothers, locates them in. And he offers them $250. Otis Merrithew offers $250 and says, we will make sure that you are given your due credit in this movie. Otis Merrithew agrees, and he helps him locate the other men. But the way he did it, Guthrie abused the situation of each man and paid them less and less and less and less and less. And some of these men are suffering from PTSD. They've turned to alcoholism. And so, for instance, Captain Danforth, who wasn't even a part of the battle. I mean, he wasn't in the ravine with the men, right? He's not a part of the battle. They paid him $1,500 for his contract, and they paid Patrick Donahue, who was a Silver Star recipient. He got the Purple Heart, all for actions that morning on 8 October. He gave him $5 and a beer, right? And so Warner Brothers is treating these men horribly, and then the media follows that, and they write stories like a bum, a trash collector, and a truck driver. And that's how they describe the other men. They shouldn't be trusted. They're jealous. They just want the money. And so Warner Brothers gets the contracts from them and continues on with the movie. And when the movie comes out, the other men are nowhere to be seen, right? Bernard Early is incorrectly depicted as the drill instructor who hates York for being religious. I mean, Early was never a drill instructor, and none of that is true. But Early is the only one whose name is really said. The rest of the movie, it's just York. And when they get to the battle scene, all the other men are shown hiding behind trees. And then after the battle, he says, he says Cutting, Kornacki, Donahue, watch those prisoners. That is the only time the men are ever mentioned. There, three of them get their name dropped. And then when they go back for the investigation in the movie, the character that's playing Colonel Buxton says, yeah, with the evidence, it sure looks that York did all the shooting and York did all the fighting. So this movie cemented for everyone that saw it that Alvin York did this single-handed. The other men did not help. The other man should not be trusted. They were just mean. They didn't like him. And York deserves everything. And that movie elevated him to, and I say in my book, to the myth that everyone knows today is because of that movie. And that movie used Tom Scahill's book, and he elevated the story and added mythical parts. So it just kind of snowballed into what we have today, where almost every publication you read about York sounds just like the movie. Every single one follows that same scheme. And that was a big issue I'm trying to fight against.
Does York ever try to extricate himself from the story that's essentially built around him? And in the decades that follow, what is his relationship like with the other members of the patrol?
Obviously, I can't speak to what York felt. Did he extricate himself? I've not found any evidence of that. Now, you read some authors and they will quote certain aspects. In the 20s, 1920, Otis Merrithew ran into him, and Alvin York brought him on stage at one of these speaking events. And he told everyone, this is the hero, he deserves all this credit. And that was the one and only time he ever brought any of the other men and gave them any credit. He would avoid going to towns that the men lived in on those speaking tours. Several times he was set to speak, and then the other men were invited by the people that created the speaking event, and then all of a sudden York would cancel. So York never went and saw any of the other men. The one everyone quotes quite often is, York said in a radio interview, there were 16 other men and they deserve all the credit, yada, yada, yada. But they never quote the date of that radio interview. It's the night before the premiere of the movie. It's a marketing theme. There's already a lot of controversy. So that's the only time he gives credit to the other men. Otherwise, it's only when asked directly by reporters, well, what about the other men? And he'll give them some vague answer. So he never publicly tried to extricate himself from it. And part of that, I think, a big part of it, especially early on, is the fact that he's in the Army. He's being told what to do and told what to say. And his the general is with him, telling him what to do and what to say, and he couldn't easily get out of it. And once you've dug that hole, it's almost impossible to get out. And so I think he just fell into that, and he was used by all these other people, by the generals, by the reporters, by Warner Brothers, who used York to their advantage. And I don't think he ever got out. So needless to say, his relationship with the other men was not good. They never got a chance to talk to him because he never showed up where they lived. And the one time they did see him at the 29 event, the War Department made it very clear they wanted them to be separated and made sure to keep York away from them as much as possible. So they never got to talk about it. So there were always hard feelings between them, because to them, all they saw was York is doing this on purpose, and he's purposely keeping us out of the story and lying to everyone. But from York's perspective, like I said, he might have just felt trapped. He couldn't get out. And that's just how he continued moving forward.
In your opinion, should York have been awarded the Medal of Honor?
See, that's always the fun question, right?
Right.
It's a tricky one, right? I mean, the reality is this. There's nothing that can be done about it. Now, did he deserve it? I could say yes. I could say no. I mean, if we're simply going off that he deserved it based upon that investigation was a sham. And that investigation was not done correctly. But I think the reality is it doesn't matter what I think. What's done is done. He has the Medal of Honor. What I think is important is that the other men receive the credit that they were due. Right. I've always argued that what's better, a story that's unbelievable because it's not possible, of this one man single-handedly doing all this, or a story of 17 men sent on a suicide mission and 11 come out with 132 prisoners. And out of the 17, you have a Medal of Honor, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, and 14 Silver Stars. Because in the end, Julian Lindsay said that he should have recommended all of them, all 17, for the Silver Star. And then by their deaths, Otis Merrithew and Bernard Early had both been recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. Only Early got his DSC. Merrithew never got his DSC. So I think that what's done is done, and I don't think it's one of those arguments on should he, shouldn't he, but rather we need to make sure everyone gets the credit due in that discussion.
York's story is a major part of the popular vision of the AEF doughboy in battle. How does your research impact York's legacy and maybe the popular vision of the AEF doughboy?
It obviously impacts his legacy, but I don't think it's to a negative. I mean, shared glory does not diminish the glory, right? I'm not taking it away. As I've said before, Alvin York would not have made it out of that ravine if it wasn't for the other 16. But on the other hand, you could also say that the other men likely wouldn't have made it out of that ravine without Alvin York. So the legacy is still there. The story is still there. It's just not single-handed. And once we break down the mythical parts, that turkey shoot that was made up by Cohen and Scahill, we take away the story that Hollywood created, we're still left with an inspirational story, a story that I think represents the AEF, a story of 17 men from all different walks of life, all across the United States, from all over the world, together with a common goal, to serve their country, and in the process obtain such a remarkable feat. And to come out of it alive is remarkable and still just as inspirational. And what they did after the war still needs to be part of it. York's legacy after the war, what he did with the money that he got, all commendable. Schools and Bible school, it's none of that is tarnished from this, because the reality is it's not York per se, right? He might have started it when he told his story, but it's not his fault. It's the officers using York for their own reputation, and it's the War Department using them for their own gratification, the authors using him, and Warner Brothers using him. They created the myth, and that's the legacy we should tear down. But the legacy of York, his actions, what he did after the war, none of that is tarnished. That's still just as commendable, and that's still just as much to do with his character as anyone else's. Just we need to add the other 16 and put that together to truly understand what an amazing moment this is in World War I and for the AEF and for the United States, in such a representative discussion that it should still be the leading doughboy message. This should still be one of the most talked about discussions, because it represents everything that the United States was at the time and is. So I don't think this book bashes. It's not the intention to bash or to tarnish the legacy, but simply correct it and give it to the public as it should be seen.
I think peeling back the myths usually result in some very fascinating history. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.